Hello. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Future Proofing Your Investment Policy Statement. My name is Rick Klaus. I am Strategic Retirement Partners Managing Director for the Columbus, Ohio and Indianapolis, Indiana offices. A few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. So all lines are going to remain on mute, but we do welcome questions. You will see a QR code throughout the slide deck. Snap that and it will take you to a spot where you can enter those questions. We'll be monitoring throughout the presentation and we will answer questions as they come in. Additionally, the session is going to be recorded, so everyone who has registered will get a copy of that recording sent to them after the webinar. Attendees can also earn an hour of SHRM and PSCA CE credit, which will also be handed out and included with that recording. So it is my pleasure to introduce Bonnie Treichel, Chief Solutions Officer at Endeavor Retirement.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Rick. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm excited to be here with a real expert in the space that we get to have Rick joining us today for this conversation. So we've got a lot to cover as we talk about investment policy statements this afternoon. And again, I'm excited to have Rick, who really is the expert out working with clients, and I will give you some of the legal foundation, and then Rick will chime in with a lot of that practical expertise. So as mentioned, we do really want to make this your session. So we have that QR code, and this will be present on every slide. So please be sure to chime in with questions and comments as we go, and we'll tackle those along the way to the extent that we're able to. With that, we'll go ahead and jump in with a little bit more of what we're going to cover on today's session, and then we'll dig further into the meat of the presentation. Rick, anything before I kind of jump in, or should we get going?
Let's roll.
All right. Well, with that, as mentioned, this is future-proofing your IPS. And you're probably thinking, what does future-proofing my investment policy statement mean? I'm really excited about today's topic because it really is coming at this from a practical perspective. Many of you, I'm sure, have had an investment policy statement for your plans that you work with for several years, but we're trying to really help you think about that practical side of, as you may have seen in a variety of different areas, as we go from one presidential administration to the next presidential administration, and then maybe back again, or go from, a conservative to or Republican to Democratic administration, they each come with their own Department of Labor. And with that Department of Labor, sometimes we get shifts in the various perspectives on different topics, things like ESG, things like private equity, things like who's even a fiduciary to giving us this advice. And that all has implications for investment recommendations and, of course, the process, such as the investment policy statement and how that framework is going to be crafted. So what we really wanted to do is practically go over, how does this change from one administration to the other, back to another, really come to play in terms of your process documentation? And that's what gave life to today's program. So hopefully you'll get some of those basics and good reminders of, first and foremost, what are those essential components of your investment policy statement? We'll do a quick reminder on the fact that you're not even legally required to have an investment policy statement, but we'll talk about why it is important to have one. We'll also talk about, the things that you don't want to have in an investment policy statement. So it's just as much about what to have as what not to have and what to avoid. And we'll talk about some of those more practical implications as we think about things like that recent executive order we had last August and the guidance that's going to come from that. Also, a recent advisory opinion we saw in retirement income. And we'll help you think about how this all comes together in your framework for selecting and monitoring investments, or working with folks like Strategic Retirement Partners who might be helping you with that as they work as a 338 investment manager, perhaps. So we'll end with some action items. And with that, again, feel free, as you might see in that bottom of your screen, to put in your questions or comments as it relates to the investment policy statement. With that, before we jump into this slide and talk about the investment policy statement and those legal requirements, I did just want to kind of take us back a step. Some of you might have joined some of our prior conversations around just ERISA requirements and some of those statutory requirements as it relates to what you're required to do under ERISA Section 404. So keep in mind that under ERISA Section 404, there's some basic requirements as a fiduciary. I'm guessing most of you on the line today are actually ERISA fiduciaries to your plans. If you're not sure, definitely be sure to reach out and talk to your consultant or advisor at SRP, and they can definitely help you understand that. But for most of you, you're probably acting as an ERISA fiduciary, which means that you have certain investment related duties, most of which are going to come in under Section 404A. Those are things like following a prudent process, or that process prudence requirement. Number two, you have that duty of loyalty requirement, doing what's in the best interest of participants. You also have a duty to diversify plan investments. And another requirement you have is to pay only reasonable fees. Now, what you might be thinking is, I didn't see anything or hear anything that she just said about a duty to have an investment policy statement. And you're exactly right. There is no legal requirement under ERISA, our federal law governing retirement plans, nor is there any kind of regulatory follow-up requirement under regulation or sub-regulatory guidance that says you must have an investment policy statement. So why are we having this webinar, and why are we going to talk for an hour about best practices for an investment policy statement? Well, one reason that we do it is because you might notice the first requirement that I met under ERISA section, or mentioned under ERISA Section 404, was this prudence requirement. One of the things that I believe a good investment policy statement does is it helps you meet that prudence requirement. So when we say prudence, again, that's just meaning that you can, for your investment related decisions, as well as other things, that you can follow an objective process and do something that's repeatable time and time again. It's objective, and you can, for example, have a process where you select investments, it's objective, it's repeatable, and you can come to an outcome that you can document and then follow up and monitor that. And you'll do so in a way that a reasonable person with reasonable facts and information would do the same thing that you did, because you arrived at that reasonable, prudent decision. The investment policy statement's what gives you the framework to be able to follow that same process and get to the same result that someone with similar information would get to that same outcome. So that's one reason to have an investment policy statement. Another reason is that it really just demonstrates to a regulator, to an auditor, to a plaintiff's attorney that you have good governance. So I'm going to give an example. There's a case recently. We always talk about litigation, and we always talk about the bad cases, right? We talk about all those cases where people lose or they pay all kinds of money, and it always sounds scary. But a lot of times there are a lot of cases that they actually are won. And so there was a case recently against Natixis, and they actually won their case. And some of the things that were noted as the reasons they won: number one, they hired an outside consultant. So they hired someone like Rick on the phone to help them with their investments. They also had regular committee meetings. Guess what else they did? They had an investment policy statement that they maintained, and they followed their investment policy statement. So again, that's another reason that you want to have it. The only flip side is that if you have an investment policy statement, you have to do what? Of course, you have to follow that investment policy statement. So that's what we'll talk more about today, is that it's a really good thing to have, but if you adopt it, you of course want to make sure that you are actually maintaining that. And ultimately, that is the plan sponsor's job, or you on the phone listening, it is ultimately your job to make sure that you follow that. So with that, we'll get into a little bit more of the differences between a 321 advisor and a 338 investment manager, and kind of who might help provide some of those sample investment policy statements, because some of you might be thinking, where do I even get these documents? But before we get there, anything, Rick, that we want to touch on before we move on?
Well, I think it's a great point. When we have spoken with clients about this, they sometimes think that because they were provided a template by their advisor, that they are no longer responsible for the maintenance of that template. So I'm glad that you brought that up, that it is ultimately their document, regardless of who provided the template.
Yeah, I think we run into that is that it's like, oh, I got this from my advisor, or, maybe I got it from some other service provider. I don't have to do anything. Ultimately, we want to remember it is still the plan sponsor's investment policy statement, their governance document. So, one of the things that we'll talk about is that our investment policy statement will typically identify roles and responsibilities of the plan sponsor or maybe the committee that comes from the plan sponsor versus, for example, who's going to actually recommend or who's going to provide that advice or maybe even discretionary advice as it relates to investments. But we want to make sure we have the right type of investment policy statement to match those roles and responsibilities so that properly outlines how are we actually going through that investment decision making process. So, one thing we thought we should do before we really jump in here is talk about the two different ways that you might be engaging with someone who's giving investment advice. So, one is typically referred to as this concept of 321. And these are just numbers, but these are the different sections of ERISA. So, section 3 is all the definitions under ERISA. 21 is where we find that definition for giving investment advice. Well, it's 321 is to become a fiduciary. And so then under that fiduciary definition for section 3, the 21st definition, then we also can have someone who takes that responsibility on with discretion. And that's the definition of an investment manager under the 38th definition. So hence why we get these different numbers. So really what we need to keep in mind is that we have someone who can make a recommendation, and then the plan sponsor can accept or reject that recommendation. That is the 321 advisor column. Or we have someone who can provide discretionary investment management. So instead, on that side of the house, we have someone where Rick might say, I made this investment change, and he's notifying as opposed to saying, hey, do you accept or reject? So maybe we'll give a little bit more color to that. And Rick, feel free to chime in here. But one of the key, yeah, go
I
ahead.
was going to say, I think one of the things that's really important in this is there's a lot of ado made about 321 versus 338 and marketing pieces. And for most good consultants, certainly for SRP, the process that you undertake as the consultant to make those recommendations or that discretionary choice is really no different behind the scenes. The difference really is that when we're sitting in front of a committee as a 321, we make a recommendation and ask for them to accept that recommendation. Whereas as a 338, we've explained the rationale for why we made that choice and why we would be moving forward with that choice.
Yep, I think that's a really good way to put that because marketing materials say a lot, but it's really how you position that in that committee meeting. And then making sure too, I think sometimes 338 in the marketplace can get described as plan sponsors no longer have to do anything. And I always like to remind that's not true either. You Even if you hire someone as a 338, you do still have a duty to monitor that 338 that you've hired. And I think that's important that while you have shifted responsibility and some liability, there is still a responsibility from the first dollar into a plan to the last dollar out that you still have to monitor any service provider that you've hired.
Great point.
And so the reason, again, that we're talking about this is that when we think about an investment policy statement, we just want to make sure that, as Rick was describing those different roles of how that gets positioned or how that decision making happens, that the roles and responsibilities piece of an investment policy statement actually properly articulates that. So with that, maybe we will move on and actually talk a little bit about the investment policy statement itself and think through what that's going to look like in terms of essential components of an IPS or investment policy statement, as well as what we don't want to do in that investment policy statement. So one of the first things, and again, The investment policy statement, there's nowhere in the regulations that say you must have X, Y, and Z, because again, this is not a required document. However, a lot of these things have been picked up in terms of best practices from various case law. When you look at cases that have gone all the way, not settled, but have gone all the way, and we've been able to see, oh, the court liked this, the court didn't like that. And we've seen it from these decisions that have gone on in various district courts, appellate courts, et cetera. So when we think about it, most investment policy statements have some sort of statement of purpose and investment objectives. Those are typically fairly high level in nature. And one thing we'll talk about a little bit later is you do want to make sure that your statement of purpose and the actual investment objectives align with the type of investments that you're going to have in the plan. So if you end up including some sort of, I'll call it retirement income component, or something that is going to stay where you've got in annuity components, for example, that are going to go beyond retirement, we don't want to have a statement of purpose or investment objectives that make clear we're supporting participants up to retirement and that's it. That wouldn't really align with what type of investments we ultimately have, and that would be a bit of a red flag. The next piece is roles and responsibilities. Typically, you will see something that identifies the role of the plan sponsor, any committee they might have identified, or who at the plan sponsor is actually making decisions, and who we've delegated to. So for example, we've delegated to a 338 or we've delegated to a 321, and what that split in roles and responsibilities are. A common place where I see questions come up would be in the selection of asset classes. So oftentimes you have the selection of asset classes, and then the next step is actually selecting the, I'll call it the designated investment alternatives, or actually the investments that go in those asset classes. Regardless of 321 or 338, sometimes I see some questions as to if the plan sponsor or if the investment advisor or investment consultant will actually be the one selecting the asset classes. Not a right or wrong answer per se, but it's important to know who's responsible for which thing, and that what's actually happening in practice aligns with what's actually in that document. So, and again, Rick, you might have thoughts on that.
Well, this is one where we see a lot of confusion, particularly among folks who maybe have seen different types of IPSs. So there, and Bonnie, maybe you can touch on that there are not an IPS for one type of plan, maybe not the same as an IPS, maybe a defined benefit plan or a foundation and endowment or a personal wealth portfolio is going to have a differently structured IPS because the decision process is different than say for a participant directed 401k, 403b.
Such a good point that, and we should have probably said that at the outset. That's a really great point, is that, you know, an investment policy statement is not one size fits all for every single type of plan or investment vehicle or pool of money. And so I think that's a really good point to make, is that it's different depending on what type of group of money or pool of money we're talking about. And so that's really important. And then also, I know Rick and I have similar perspectives on this, that, and he might have been getting ready to go there, of, do we need to identify every single vendor in the universe?
Exactly. Yes, we do see some investment policy statements, particularly when we're initially working with a new client where their previous consultant has felt the need to identify very prescriptive things in that investment policy down to asset specific asset classes and things that could ultimately be restrictive to a committee. And that might be, again, appropriate in a DB where you're monitoring an asset allocation that is being driven by the committee. But in a participant directed plan, you don't necessarily want those types of restrictions placed on you as a committee. So having it be less prescriptive and covering things at a high level and providing some flexibility, I think, is always a better place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in the category of roles and responsibilities, for example, we need to identify those who have investment related duties, but we don't need to identify every other service provider to the plan and what their duties are. This is not a catch all document for everything under the sun. And I think there are floating around some historical documents where it became this catch all type of place. And one of the things that I fear is that it puts plan sponsors in a place where their contracts for various service providers doesn't align with their investment policy statement that says my record keeper does this, my TPA does this, and it's, to Rick's point, very prescriptive in nature, and that's exactly what we want to avoid. So try, again, as an action item, and we'll talk about this more at the end, make sure you take a quick look at your investment policy statement and try to eliminate places where you would then start to have all these conflicting documents, because less is more, and we'll talk about that a bit more here in a moment. Other things that you will include, and I'll kind of put 3 and 4 together here, is that while you're not going to identify the list of investments, again, there's another place for that, not here, you would instead include the process, right? It's about the process to pick the investments. And your process can be that we're going to use first we're going to select, and then we're going to, once we have it in the plan, we're going to continue to monitor, and we might put on watch list, and then we would remove, whatever that is, or we're going to use a 13-point scoring system. There's a variety of different ways you can do that, but it's about the process we go to select and the process for monitoring and the process for removing. It's a process piece, not a here's our list of investments. So it's whatever process you use, and that's really what this document is all about, is process. It can also talk about frequency, documentation. That being said, I also am not a proponent of saying we're going to do this once per quarter, or we're going to do this once every 2 quarters. That frequency with that specificity could really get you in trouble. And I'll kind of move on to the next slide as I tell this story. But again, I told you a great news story earlier about a case that relied on an investment policy statement. I'll tell you the opposite of that as we move into this next slide. There's a case recently where, from using an investment policy statement, it ended up with both the plan sponsor and it ended up with the advisor ending on the other end of litigation. And we don't know how the case will play out, but the argument is basically that based on the target date funds they were using, they had an investment policy statement that they did not follow. And it was a fairly good sized plan, but it was one that it wasn't just your, $2 billion plan. It was a large plan, but not a mega plan. And so this can happen. And the issue was it had very specific language about after X amount of quarters, we must remove. And they didn't do that. So that very prescriptive, specific language resulted in a lawsuit for not following their own governance documents.
Well, and one of the beauties of ERISA is that it is not an outcomes-based standard, right? It is a process-based standard. So why would we want documents that drive us to a specific outcome and monitor that versus really focusing on how we take this through the process?
That's so spot on. And that's always one of the things I say I love about ERISA is that you don't have to get the right answer. You don't have to get the best investment option. You don't have to get the cheapest investment option. You just have to demonstrate a process. So don't create too rigid of a process for yourself that you'll never be able to follow. We've talked about a few of these already, but just kind of a reminder to wrap this part of it up. Again, avoiding that overly rigid language, refraining from including funds by name. Again, I don't include typically funds by name. I don't include asset classes by name. Again, if you are going to get too specific, always use that including but not limited to type of language, but try to avoid that specificity to the extent possible. when you think about it too, make sure that you think in terms of you have this process document, but then you also probably have, and Rick will have some additional thoughts on this, you have your process document, and then on that quarterly basis, or maybe it's, twice a year, you're getting probably an investment report, and that's going to have that specificity. And then that's oftentimes backed up by some sort of meeting notes or meeting minutes where you can get more specific as to the rationale for XYZ decision, which demonstrates your prudent process. And that's where more of that specificity can come in.
I think that's exactly where this needs to be, is that having the IPS is really that overarching kind of nudging you in the right direction, but all of the specificity and it really leads to the committee and them executing that process and then documenting that via the reports that we as the consultant provide, and then the meeting minutes that really get into what was discussed, what questions were asked, and how did you come to whatever decision you made within the scope of that larger investment policy statement.
Yeah, it's just that balancing act, but again, less is more when it actually comes to the investment policy statement. Um, and I know, we've talked about this a little bit, but when we say less is more, does that mean like have a 20 page, a 10 page, a 4 page? Like, Rick, what are we talking about here?
Well, we used to have a much shorter one than we have now, but as some of these other things have come out, retirement income, managed accounts, you're having to allow for at least the potential inclusion of these. So we're seeing investment policy statements start to expand again. But to your point, I think the real piece that we want to continue to trim out of them wherever we can is that specificity, that prescriptive nature of you must do this or you must do that, and essentially handcuffing potentially a committee if there's ever litigation that maybe in a given quarter they didn't do one of those things and it led to a poor outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good segue into kind of how we'll tackle the second half of this presentation, which is, we've done the reminder on what is an investment policy statement and some best practices, but kind of getting back to what I mentioned in the very beginning of this session, what we wanted to really help you do is think about, okay, well, how does this really apply in terms of, with all of the changing regulation, with some of the things we anticipate are yet to come, how do I actually put this into practice and make this something that creates long-term sustainability? One of the things that I'd heard in just working with some advisors as well as some plan sponsors over the last couple of years was, I don't really want to take any action because I don't know what's going to happen, so I'll just wait and see. But if we're always waiting to see, that can be something that really creates a roadblock to innovation and best outcomes for participants, because we're always waiting to see and then we're afraid to do anything, which I very much so appreciate that perspective. But it creates this, I don't want to get sued, which I don't blame you, but it's, I don't want to get sued and I'll wait and see what the Department of Labor does. And then we're in this place of not being able to move forward and do what we really want to do for the best interest of our participants. So how can we really think about, given the regulatory environment, given the litigation environment, which we know litigation is not slowing down. In fact, if anything, if we look at the numbers from 23, 24, and 25 with new cases, it's only continuing to go up. Given that, how do we create this sustainable framework that allows us to move forward? So we thought we'd use a couple of examples from just some of the recent activity, both coming from the White House, but that's going to trickle down from a regulatory perspective as well, and think about how can we actually adopt this into what you're doing with your actual day-to-day practices from an investment policy statement. And maybe I'll pause there. Any questions so far, Rick, or anything that we need to chime in?
You are doing a fantastic job. You have made it so nobody has any questions.
Well, or we've got people who are not as engaged as we want them to be. So feel free, everyone, to chime in if you've got specific questions on how this is playing out in your plans or anything that you're seeing, because what's interesting is some of these things have actually been making headline news and mainstream media. We really have never seen 401k plans in the news as much as we have here in the last year or so. So the first example that we were going to use is the executive order from August. So again, what we're talking about is last August, the White House actually came out in a public statement and an executive order and said that we needed the Department of Labor as well as the Securities Exchange Commission to re-examine the rules around private equity and other alternative investments. And I'll get into kind of what alternative investments means here in a minute. But we needed these agencies to take another look at the rules for alternative investments for 401k plans, so that 401k, 403b, and other DC plans, so that we had more access and democratization of these alternative investments for participants. So what does that mean in plain English? And maybe we should talk about both what that requires, but also what that does not require, because it's about what it's not requiring you to do as much as it is what it's requiring you to do. So simply put, this said, hey, Department of Labor, for purposes of this conversation, within 180 days, you need to come out with some sort of guidance that will help to reevaluate, let's call it alternative assets, which includes private equity, hedge funds, commodities. It also included digital assets like crypto, as well as lifetime income investment solutions, or those annuity-based solutions. So come out with guidance that will help make that more available to working Americans, the same way it has been available in defined benefit plans and in for high net worth investors and their own investment accounts for many years. So what does that mean exactly? Well, what it means is that, number one, you don't have to take any action today at all, because that was just directing an agency to do something. It wasn't directing plan fiduciaries to do a single thing. So I think that's the helpful piece, because a lot of the headline news made it seem like you actually had to take some sort of action today. And I think that was a bit misleading. So plan fiduciaries don't have to do anything. That being said, it was a signal that more was coming soon. And so I think it's helpful to know we believe that here very soon we will get regulatory guidance from the Department of Labor as it relates to these investment types. So maybe I'll pause there for a second. And Rick, any thoughts so far on kind of these investment types or what you're hearing from plan sponsors?
Many, with the exception of maybe lifetime income, I think some of the others have been, they have been somewhat on folks' minds. But one thing, and I would be curious if you would agree, we have cautioned plan sponsors that just because they may ultimately end up being allowed, it doesn't necessarily equal prudence to put them in your plan. And I think there is we can have them now, that means we should have them. And that may or may not be the case, depending on the sophistication level of your plan participants, et cetera.
Yep. So I think I have taken that exact same approach, is that just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so I think one of the things when we think about the framework of what this does and how it impacts us is that, going back to what I said at the very, very beginning, there are these basic duties under ERISA. They're under ERISA Section 404. Duty of prudence, you have to follow your prudent process. Duty to diversify the investment types, that duty for reasonable fees, as well as the duty of loyalty. We've got to put the best interest of participants first. And when we think about it, it's the best interest of all participants. So we could have one person on the committee who says, hey, I really want to have private equity in the plan, or I really want to have XYZ in the plan. But just because one person's sophisticated enough doesn't mean our participant population is. So what we really have to think about is what's best for the entire participant population, not just one participant or a couple of participants. So it really takes us back to, Rick, as you said, our overall kind of framework and making sure that our investment policy statement is positioned for that prudent process for all investment types and not just for, oh, this is the shiny new object. Let's just add X or do Y for this one new thing that a few participants said they wanted. And so I think that's something I've really been emphasizing. So
Absolutely. And it's always easier, I think, when you speak with committees to put it in the first time, but then when you need to get it out, it always seems to be harder to get it out of the plan after you put it in the first place. So always be careful about putting things in just because they seemed like a good idea in a given moment.
well, that's a great segue to this next topic, which is a subcomponent of what we were just talking about. So, the one of the examples that followed on from that executive order was an advisory opinion that came shortly after. So, a few things have happened since that advisory opinion. The White House said, "Hey, we need X." Then immediately thereafter, the Department of Labor withdrew some of their guidance from the Biden administration on private equity. So there was a little bit of guidance that said, hey, small plans really shouldn't have private equity in their plan. The Department of Labor withdrew that so that we're left with some earlier guidance that says, yep, for now, as long as it's part of a multi-asset solution, like a target date fund or something, then plans, as long as they have a prudent process, can have private equity in the plan. That came out. Then shortly thereafter, we got what's showing on the screen now, which is an advisory opinion. And this is related to lifetime income. So again, I believe this is a follow-up directly from that executive order. This came from the Department of Labor, and this is related to lifetime income, or rather annuities, as a component of a QDIA, or qualified default investment option. So when we have participants who don't otherwise make an election, then this is where the annuity becomes part of that target date fund. And this is for AllianceBernstein's specific solution, which is a lifetime income strategy, or LIS strategy, at AllianceBernstein. So what does this really mean in plain English? For those of you who've kind of taken a look at this lifetime income annuity type of solution in the plan before, what this means is a couple of fold. One, this only applies to AllianceBernstein because it's an advisory opinion. However, if you were questioning, can you have annuities as a part of a QDIA? This helps to confirm that yes, you can do that. But what it also says is that if you are thinking about the safe harbor for selection of the insurers, and again, if this is sounding like this is getting into deep in the weeds information, we've got some other things and follow up with your SRP advisor on it. But if you're thinking about using the safe harbor for selection of an underlying insurer on an annuity product, this gives some guidance on how you as a plan sponsor can select an investment manager to go through that safe harbor on your behalf. And so that was another piece that came out of this as well. So in terms of then, well, okay, what do I do with that? How does this actually fit into my investment policy statement? Well, a couple of things that you'd want to be thinking about, just given the Department of Labor continuing to push forward retirement income or these annuity type solutions. Number one, go back to that statement of purpose and investment objectives and make sure that that actually aligns with what you're trying to accomplish with those investment types. So again, you can't have annuities in the plan if you have something that is a to retirement type of objective. That wouldn't really align. And so you don't have to change your IPS to say, we're going to include annuities, but you need to make sure you have something that has more of a, we're going to support our participants through their retirement years. That would be the type of language that you'd want to include. The other thing you might want to think about is using, and this is where, Rick, I welcome your opinion on this. A lot of times with all of these newer types of things that are making investment policy statements longer, I like to use some sort of an appendix or something of that nature, because for, let's say, retirement income, you might add a solution, you might not. You might just add an appendix where you've added some of the qualitative and quantitative metrics but you're not, again, we're not saying after 3 months we must have X track record or that sort of language. It's more about, we will look at these qualitative and quantitative factors, including the safe harbor criteria, and we're leaving that pretty high level, but it's an appendix that you can add on if you determine you're going to vet one of those solutions in the future.
Without question, I think there needs to be additional documentation in the investment policy that allows for something over and above. Most of the time, when we're thinking about funds, I don't want to make light of it, but it's a much more simple calculation when you're looking and scoring a large cap growth fund or a small cap value fund or whatever that might be. Target dates brought a level of complexity, and now when you think about adding in some sort of annuity or lifetime income component to that, it brings just that next level of complexity to this, which requires not only those quantitative pieces. Let's think about fees, let's think about potential performance, et cetera, but how does this fit with our given participant population? Do our folks stay in our plan? Does everybody leave? Is this something that would benefit them? And all of those questions should be asked and discussed at the committee level, but the policy needs to allow for that sort of discussion and then some criteria around which to base it.
Yeah, and where you particularly got us to as we started this topic is on, that more portability type of question too, and the ability to, what do we do with these once we put it into a plan? How do we get it back out of the plan? And so I think those are the types of criteria we want to be thinking about, because it's not just performance-based or fee-based type things. It really is that operational aspect too, which can be critically important because, as you said so well, once you put it in, it might be tough to get back out.
Agreed.
Anything else on retirement income?
It's a big topic, and I think there's a lot of people who are very excited about it. I think I have been doing this. It always sounds funny to say this, since the turn of the century, and we used to have retirement income in plans. It was called joint and survivor annuities, and consultants like me spent 20 years amending it out of plans because nobody wanted it anymore. And now here we are bringing income back to plans, which I think is actually a good thing at the high level, but it adds a level of complexity that a lot of sponsors just haven't dealt with in a while.
Yeah, I think it's back, and I think there's a big effort to making it happen. But to your point, I think there is a lot of complexity, and making sure that there is the right support from an advisor or consultant to help go through that process, and a lot of different solutions that have their own nuances in getting it across the finish line as well.
And I think most sponsors are very well intentioned with trying to take up these type of things. But our friends in plaintiffs bar have certainly reinforced the statement that no good deed goes unpunished in many cases. And so when you put these in, you may ultimately open yourself up for some sort of litigation event that you didn't anticipate by trying to do what you felt was the right thing for a particular participant group.
I love that saying, no good deed goes unpunished. Well, with that, let's shift to another thing that came up with that executive order, which is another interesting topic. So if we think back all the way to 2022, we initially got some guidance. This was under the Biden administration, the Biden administration's Department of Labor and EBSA, that said essentially no crypto. In other words, this was around the time where we had a major record keeper making an announcement about their platform being able to handle crypto or digital assets as a part of the plan's core lineup up to 20%. We had some other bigger announcements coming out. And so we had the Biden administration's DOL coming out with what was called the compliance assistance release. So again, in our kind of hierarchy of guidance, a compliance assistance release is sub-regulatory guidance. So it's not legislation that you have to follow. It's not a federal court saying you have to do something. It's not even a regulation that interprets, anything. It is sub-regulatory, which is just general guidance. That being said, if the Department of Labor is putting out something and saying, hey, we're going to probably do an investigation if you have this in your plan, you typically do want to listen to that. And they gave 5 specific reasons why they were concerned about crypto and digital assets. They also, in addition to those 5 concerns, really highlighted why, if you also had this in brokerage accounts, and when I say this, if you had digital assets in brokerage accounts, they really accentuated their concern, even in brokerage accounts, which historically have been considered to be off limits from the Department of Labor. The department has typically said you have a duty to prudently select and monitor the brokerage window service provider as it relates to the service and fees, but the underlying investment options, that is not a duty of the plan sponsor or plan fiduciary. That's on the participants. So since then, you saw the brokerage window piece was pulled back. And then even more recently, I'll get to that in a minute, we've seen a change in this initial guidance. But the concerns were, number one, that crypto's been extremely volatile. That was one of the concerns. There's been concerns about less sophisticated investors not really understanding, concerns about just generally the custodial and record keeping requirements and the cybersecurity concerns about it, also valuation concerns, and finally just that really the regulatory landscape wasn't ready for it. But then, as we talked about earlier, we had the executive order in August, and again, we also, in conjunction with around that same time, slightly earlier, we saw that the Compliance Assistance Release 2025-01, so last year, the prior release from the Biden administration, now under the Trump administration's Department of Labor, they said, no, we do not agree with what we said in 2022. Instead, we go back to what we've always done, which is we don't endorse certain investment types. We don't say, we disapprove of certain investment types, but it's back to what I said under the big legislative piece and Section 404 of ERISA, which says follow a prudent process. This is about prudence. And back to what Rick said about this is a process. We go through our process. It's not about the outcome, it's about the process. And that's where the department has landed for now as it relates to cryptocurrency. Rick, what did I miss there?
I think that's fantastic. I will say that the interest in crypto has ebbed and flowed with the price of crypto. So every time crypto has a big run up, everybody thinks they should have it in their plan. And then when it experiences some of the ebbs that it has at times, we seem to get a lot less interest from those same plan sponsors in putting it in the plan.
And I'm guessing participants and participant demand, we see that as well as kind of what plan sponsors are hearing and reporting back go the same direction. So I do think we'll continue to see that same thing coming from participants as we go along. So, just keeping in mind that standard really is that care, skill, prudence, and diligence of the professional fiduciary role under comparable or similar circumstances. That is the role not only with respect to crypto, but with respect to any other investment type. It is that prudent process, the prudence and diligence. That is that role of the plan fiduciary. So when evaluating crypto or other digital assets, just keep in mind that the department doesn't endorse nor deny the ability to add crypto, but you're following your typical prudent process. So when you think about, hey, should we add this to our plan? I'm not sure that you necessarily need to have anything special. If you're thinking in terms of future proofing your investment policy statement, I'm not really sure that you need to think about anything special for your investment policy statement other than some of those operational things, like, does my platform allow this? You may be thinking in terms of if you decide to use a brokerage window, because that might be a place where access can be made available to participants as opposed to in the core investment lineup. So you may be thinking, hey, how can I make this available? And where should I add that brokerage window component? But I'm not sure that you really would need to add much to an investment policy statement to account for crypto if it's going to be, and Rick, I'm not even aware many record keepers that would even have this available as a designated investment alternative at this point.
Agreed. We don't see it. Not yet. I think it's coming, but we don't see it yet.
Agreed. So I think this is something to be on the lookout for, but as of today, I don't see this as something that you're seeing, but it is something to be on the lookout for. And that kind of brings us to a wrap up point on a few of these topics, which is we talked about this executive order, we talked about more guidance coming. So what happens with the executive order is the Department of Labor was required to come up with new guidance. The new guidance got dropped off at what's called the Office of Management and Budget, and that happened in mid-January. Typically, we see that rules come out within 60 days from the Office of Management and Budget because that office has to review the regulatory body's proposed rule and then they publish it in the Federal Register. We have not seen that come out. I would anticipate that proposed rule any day now as it relates to alternatives, digital assets, et cetera. I would anticipate that to come out any day now. We do know that they asked for more time on the review, and that was in mid-February. So it could take a little bit longer. But the big takeaway is that we will get some sort of proposed regulation that will impact plan fiduciaries in the coming days. There'll be a notice and comment period, so it'll go out in the Federal Register. Anyone on the line can comment on that if you choose to do so. And then as a follow-up, then we'll eventually see a final rule that will say what you actually have to do as a plan fiduciary as it relates to your investment related responsibilities. So that's coming. Be on the lookout. As I know, SRP will provide additional information when that comes out. And so just be on the lookout for something from your partners at SRP as it relates to that additional guidance. I know we're getting close to the top of time, so be sure to ask any questions that you might have. But with that, a few of the action items that we've talked about today. So make sure that you are talking to your advisor or consultant about any questions related to your investment policy statement. You certainly want to make sure that you understand how things like the regulatory or legislative changes, the executive order, you want to know, hey, does our IPS need to be updated based on any of those things? So you always want to make sure that if it's from a regulatory, a legislative, a big change in participant population, all of those things, even a change in company values, right? Like if something big has changed, you want to make sure your investment policy statement continues to be aligned with that. I think at least annually is a good time to just do a quick check-in on your investment policy statement. You don't necessarily have to write in your IPS that we will do this annually, because if you don't do it annually, you don't want to get stuck in that, hey, I wrote this down and didn't do it. But I think that's a good goal, is to do that at least once annually. And then, of course, when you do update your IPS, make sure that you actually get that final copy in the file, that you start using that final copy. All your plan fiduciaries are aware of that new investment policy statement and that you've documented it. So with that, maybe I'll pause. Rick, what have I missed that we wanted to cover today and haven't?
I think you touched on all of the pieces that we at least try to get across to committees as we're walking through these, which is you need a document that covers a very high level process, but you don't want to put yourself in a position where if there ever were to be litigation, that you are sitting on the witness stand having to answer very detailed questions about an investment policy statement that maybe you aren't as familiar with as you thought, when in reality you could have avoided all of that having a less prescriptive investment policy statement and relying on the actions of the full committee and the minutes to support the decisions that have been made along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe our last action item is just to make sure that, for those who weren't listening today, that they are able to get access to either the training that we've done today, or that you go back and as you listen, that you've taken some notes and can go back and train the rest of the group. So certainly thanks, for joining today. I'll turn it back over to Rick to wrap us up, and really appreciate everyone's time.
Well, thanks again to everyone who joined us today. I really appreciate the time, appreciate your interest in the topic. Again, for those of you who have SRP consultants, if there's questions about this, please feel free to reach out to them. We're happy that you were here. You've noticed the certificate for your SHRM that just popped up. So again, that will be sent out with the recording. I know that is always a great incentive for folks to join these, is to get a little SHRM credit as well. So again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out, and we thank you again for your time today.